So the notes I'm going to share with you tonight are but a set of partial observations and incomplete reflections. And I would like you to take them in that spirit so that during the conversation that will follow, we can make something together out of these incomplete observations. Most of these observations are drawn really from my life experience in South Africa since 2000. If anything, they mostly reflect, I have to say, my experience in Gauteng. And I'm not sure that they would mean much to somebody speaking, say, from the Cape or from Limpopo, or for that matter, from KwaZulu-Natal. What I would like to do tonight is to develop a mode of argument, to problematize something that could possibly be called a South African moment. Something which, almost by definition, can only be highly ambiguous, can only be considered as a moment of irresolution, because the argument is that in spite of what happened in 1994, most crucial questions affecting this country have not been resolved. And we are still living in a moment of irresolution. A moment which itself is, of course, very complex. Don't believe anyone who comes to you and tells you that the South African question is simple. It's not. It is very complex. It is versatile. It is the product of diverse empirical situations, most of which have been documented in recent scholarship, and also which then form somewhat the background for the more speculative reflections I'm going to offer. So to put it somewhat telegraphically, the question I would like to ask tonight goes something like this. What kind of order, social, political, cultural order, is in the making in South Africa in the aftermath of apartheid? Of what is it the mask, both in the manner of its constitution and in what it ends up constituting, and why? So if you wish, these are the two questions I would like to explore tonight. I would like now to go through, let's say, 5 or 6 main assumptions that derive from the question I have just asked. It seems to me that in order to understand what is going on in South Africa now, we have to start from something that should be self-evident, which is that society does not exist spontaneously. Human societies have to be produced. They do not exist just like that. Social orders are human productions. They have to be produced. And this being the case, the dominant forms of the production of the social that have emerged after apartheid or that are in the making were in fact already contained in the folds of apartheid itself. That's the first major statement I would like to make tonight. That what we are witnessing, in fact, was already in germination within that form, social, political form, apartheid was. The second is that South Africa is far from becoming a failed state. You have here and there, you have some commentators who argue that this country is about to just fall within that category known as failed states. So my argument is that no, it is far from becoming a failed state, yet at the same time, although a significantly changing society, I've been here for the last 14 years and I've seen major changes. When I arrived here in 2000, a number of things didn't exist, they are there today. This is a place that is in a process of rapid transformation. Some of that transformation is planned, but most of it is unplanned. So, although a significantly changing society, the country is not moving decisively towards what it could become. I insist on that question of what it could become as a way of reintroducing the question of the future in our political discussions, our political debate. What has happened is that the future as a political category was central during the years of the struggle. The struggle was about the kind of future we wanted to live in. After 1994, this orientation towards the future, this disposition towards the future, has been significantly eroded. You do not hear in our political discourse today any serious reference to the future. You hear all kinds of references to the past and to not even the present, but to the instant. And the argument is that this relationship to time, to historicity, if you want to use a big word, or to temporality, is absolutely central in the making of societies. And therefore, if we want to understand what's going on here today, we have to take seriously South Africans' relationship to time. Why is it that, for the most part, our references are in the past, or our references are, we refer to the instant, to the now, and why is it that we put the future into parentheses? And in putting the future into parentheses, what is it that we do not allow ourselves to imagine and to project as a possibility, not only for us, but also for those who are coming behind us? So, the country is not moving decisively towards what it could become. In some instances, it is in a stationary state. It is in a state of stagnation. But this stagnation and apparent inertia, I would say, is largely deceptive. It is deceptive because below the surface, a protracted struggle is unfolding. New kinds of struggles are unfolding, which might not have much to do with the kinds of struggles people here were involved in, let's say, the 60s, 70s, 80s, or even early 90s. But people haven't stopped struggling. New struggles are unfolding. They are protracted in the sense that it is not very clear how they will be resolved, or who will win, start that on go. Now, how should we characterize these unfolding struggles? I think in two ways. First, these are struggles that do only partially express themselves through the exploitation of cheap black labor. Although the exploitation of cheap black labor is still a crude fact of daily life, especially in the farms and in the mines, where migrant wage seekers face quasi-permanent adverse economic contingencies as they try to leverage their way out of poverty and insecurity. So they only partially express themselves through the exploitation of cheap black labor, which has always been a key feature of South African modes of capitalist accumulation. That capitalist accumulation in South Africa historically have been fundamentally made possible, of course, by the development of technologies like that, but more importantly, by what I should call a racial subsidy. That racial subsidies have been a key element of modes of capitalist accumulation in South Africa. They are still, this is still the case, but to a far lesser extent, say that in the 70s or the 80s. So that's the first characteristic of these unfolding struggles. Second, a main feature of this protracted struggle is that it involves not a single social class, as we used to learn in the Marxist vocabulary. It involves multiple, I would call them, new social protagonists. Now, you'll ask me, but who are these new social protagonists? And I would say, fundamentally, wageless people. Let's call them wageless people. Subaltern, to be sure. People whose everyday life is radically precarious, is radically insecure. People whose condition, their condition is a condition of insecurity. And when I say insecurity, I should add radical insecurity. People who are not sure of making it from today to tomorrow. People whose main preoccupation when they wake up in the morning is to find out how is it that they will make it from today to tomorrow. People who are not passive at all, but people whose myriad forms of mobilization and praxis, in fact, urgently calls for description, interpretation, and theorization. Whether this praxis takes the form of litigation, you see them undertaking to go to courts to make sure that justice is done, that what is owed to them indeed is given to them. They also resort to violent protests, and as you know very well, the number of violent protests, South Africa is the protest capital of the world. Let's just put it like that. And I'm not exaggerating at all. We do have some colleagues at the University of Johannesburg who have been working on these issues. People here, Richard is in the room. We are the protest capital of the world. So why is it that people are protesting all the time? Why are they angry? We're a very angry country. Why are people angry? These are questions we have to keep asking. And in some cases, their praxis takes the form of riots or peaceful demonstrations that end up in riots. For instance, the other day in Johannesburg, economic freedom fighters went to storm the parliament. It started like in the mode of a peaceful demonstration. It ended up in the mode of a riot. They forced themselves inside the parliament. They sat. Some of them had never sat on the beautiful chairs one finds in the hotel legislature, leather chairs like that. We enjoyed it. It happened that when they moved in, parliamentarians, MECs like that, they had their food ready. So they helped themselves, drank bottles of wine. Some of those bottles, they are drunk for us by the leadership. This time it was not by the leadership. The people themselves drank wine that is produced out of their work. And of course, there was a serious confrontation with the police. You know about this. The problem, I'm telling you all of this, because there is a fundamental problem underlying all of this. Why is it that we live in a society in which, in order to somewhat be heard, and it is far from being given, one must necessarily shout or scream? This raises all kinds of questions for the practice of democracy, in the sense that there can't be a democracy where voice is suppressed. That goes without saying. But it is not enough to have a voice. Voice only matters to the extent of its being listened to. And when one is not listened to, then one has a tendency to riot, to scream, or to shout in the hope of forcing whoever has to listen to listen. So, how is it that we develop an ethics of listening? Lots of people like listening to themselves. How is it that we move from listening to ourselves, being fond of our voice, to listening to each other as a primary modality for a democratic relationship? It seems to me another important question we have to look into. It is not simply a technical question, because once again we live in a place where everything has been thoroughly depoliticized, and we are led to believe that everything we face is a technical matter. And that technicism, or technocracy, if you want to be gentle, will resolve all our problems. That our problems are administrative problems and bureaucratic problems, or technical problems. They are never political. So what we see with this matter of voice and being listened to is that and questions of the future. And we have to somewhat repoliticize our predicament at a time when the kind of economic system we live in encourages us to depoliticize everything and to deactivate citizenship and plug it as a precondition for the triumph of an ideology that pretends that society doesn't exist, only individuals exist, and if you can't make it, we are really sorry, it's your fault. So it seems to me that in trying to read South Africa now, we have to bring back some of these issues. Third assumption, I just argued a moment ago that for its operations, South South African modes of capital's accumulation relied historically on racial subsidies. And I also said that to a certain extent, they still rely on racial subsidies. What I have to add now is that the nature and the extent of, let's call it the racial wage, is itself changing. It is changing as a consequence of at least two processes. First is the expansion of a so-called black middle class, the sociology of which still needs to be done, I have to say. What are the features of the middle class? Can we say that someone who earns, let's say, 12,000 rands a month belongs to the middle class? What is the middle class who belongs to the middle class in a context in which the RDP house you have been given, you cannot leverage it to obtain credit at a bank? So what I mean is that we still need to do some proper empirical work when we say black middle class, what does it consist of, who belongs to it, so forth and so on. So that's the first thing. Now, when we say the black community, I mean, it is, like I would say, every community, it is divided. It is not a single unit. Second is the crystallization at the margins of society of a mounting army of those who, having been expelled from work and having been reduced to scream in order to be heard, are condemned to a wageless life. And you already have people who are born, they grow up, they get old, and they will never have the kind of formal job we usually think of when we think of life of wages. That they are condemned to a wageless life. And there are millions of these people. So wagelessness is no longer just a situation. It is a condition which for many is permanent. It is permanent. So, in other words, the terms under which racial subsidies are constituted and deployed have changed, and racial protagonism no longer simply opposed to two generic blocks, blacks and whites. In ways hardly experienced before, it now cuts through both categories and in between. So, for instance, when Alema says Cyril Ramaphosa is a black Boer, it seems to me he's capturing precisely this fragmentation, which is internal to these big racial blocks. This fragmentation that is making it such that now we have fractions of black people who, because of their objective interest, will develop policies that go against the poor among the black community. That is an objective condition that one has to take into account when looking into, let's say, the new class making process in South Africa. Another important point that needs to be taken into consideration when reading the present, it has to do with the fact that, let's call it the liberation myth. And I use myth here in a positive sense, in a sense Cassiran the German philosopher uses. The liberation myth is fast eroding. It is fast eroding, and yet the paradox is that although it is eroding, the ANC is still able to milk its symbolic dividends. So the question is, why is it that the thing is fast dissipating, and yet its symbolic dividends are still there, and one political formation is still capable of milking it? Or if you want another kind of question, when can we expect these dividends to finally dry up? Not just by themselves, because it certainly never happens like that. Who are those specific social actors who are busy trying to make sure that these dividends dry up? And how are they going about doing it? How are they actively going about doing it? It seems to me that if one wants to understand, for instance, the current politics of the EFF, these are the kinds of questions we have to ask. They are actively engaged in the process of making sure that in 5, 10 years, these dividends have dried up and the ANC cannot swim in them anymore. And it seems to me, for those of you who read newspapers, this Sunday, in the Sunday Independent, there was a ferocious discussion between Mbuyiseni Ndlozi, who happens to be a student of ours at Rhodes University and is the spokesperson of the EFF, and the ANC media liaison officer. Both of them fighting it out over whether or not the EFF is, as Gwede Mantashe tells us, a fascist organization. If you read that debate, full page, half each, you will understand what I mean. The EFF is, among many other things, actively involved in making sure that these symbolic dividends dry up. And now, what will the ANC do when they finally dry up? Still projecting ourselves towards the future. What happened in Zimbabwe, for example, when they dried up under Mugabe? So I think the choices will become clearer. We are approaching that moment when So I just say that current cultural climate is characterized by the exhaustion of all utopias of liberation, truth, reconciliation, and their replacement by, I would say, an increasingly dystopian imagination. Where is it that you find that dystopian imagination? You find it a lot in South African fiction. South African new fiction. The kind of fiction that is making its waves right now in South Africa has to do with science fiction, but a kind of science fiction in which, let's say, the order, social order we're used to is not simply falling apart, but is fractured in multiple segments. A moment of a term comes in French, fractionnement. How would you say? Of implosion, if you want. Things implode, and there is no longer any coherent whole, two. There are multiple pieces flowing here and there, like, let's say you break a glass and you have everything shatters. So you see these thematic appearing especially in important part of current South African fiction. You see it also in the musical styles. The kind of music we have been listening to, dancing, dominant urban music since the 90s. When you talk to the composers, musicians of that, is what they are trying to capture. A dystopian imagination that is itself can see it also in the kind of structural attachment to the struggle. It's a structure that is purely melancholic, if only because it gestures towards a receding past, rather than, as I said, to the future. Now let me comment a little bit on the modes of governance that I think accompany all of this. I think that the continued dominance of the ANC rests on a paradox. It has as much to do with the ANC newly found capacity to feed on the internal crisis it generates. That we have here a political formation that has developed the capacity to reproduce itself through its own internal crisis. And when you expect the crisis to bring it down, in fact, it will use the crisis to perpetuate itself. Just like capitalism, if you want. Capitalism is a bit like that. I mean, in 2008, after the big crash, we all thought, goodness me, here we go. We are just there. And look today. Accelerationism. So, I am suggesting that the former liberation movement, contrary maybe to what has happened in Zimbabwe or in Mozambique, the uniqueness of the ANC is that it's developing that capacity to generate crises where they are not necessary. You go and produce a crisis as a way of managing your own self-perpetuation. That on the one hand. And on the other hand, it is holding a formula of governance we should call the modulation of inertia. When you think of inertia, you think of, let's say, Table Mountain in Cape Town. Table Mountain is there, it looks totally stable. It's not, I mean, from a geological perspective, it has changed a lot. The modulation of inertia is the capacity to manage what looks like a movement. To move it skillfully in order to produce the kind of effects one is looking for. And how is it that this inertia is modulated? It is modulated through a machine, the constitution of a machine whose function is to allocate tenders, grants, privileges, perks, positions, resources to those who remain loyal to it, while severely crushing any kind of internal dissent. I'll give you one example. We talk about tenders. At some point, the allocation of tenders was more or less centralized. Then, I can't remember exactly at what period of time, but not so long ago, it was decentralized. I have a colleague of ours who works at the Institute for Public Research and Administration. His name is Achille. They are doing some empirical work on tenders. What they have discovered is that Today, if you want, for instance, to put a tender for books, there are thousands of places from where you can do that. There have been a democratization of tenders, which comes hand in hand with the possibility of proliferation of points of entry into mechanisms of corruption, to the point where, in a province like Eastern Cape, nobody truly knows what is going on. Add to that Limpopo, Mpumalanga, Northwest, and you have a huge machine specialized in capturing floating resources, prioritizing them, public resources, and redistributing them along channels, patron-client channels, and building, therefore, a patrimonial state that is not unlike what we have seen earlier on in places like Nigeria, like the Congo and the Mobutu. There's the importance of what Michael was saying, that in fact, if we want to understand what's going on here today, we better look also elsewhere in the continent to see how post-colonial processes, post-colonial predicaments have unfolded. And this is what usually happens in the aftermath of decolonization. We'll be reading Fanon tomorrow, chapter 5 or 6, Pitfalls of National Consciousness. You read it, you think he's talking about South Africa today. But in fact, he was talking about the rest of the continent in the 60s, early 60s. So the motivation of inertia seems to me the kind of modes of governance that has succeeded, that has come after the other one that used to be there. Under a party, it was a society of control. What we have, so if you want to ask me what has been the main event since the 90s, the main event in South Africa has been the transition from a society of control to, I would say, a society of consumption. There are historical reasons why this is the case. South Africa's democratization happens exactly at the time when Cold War is over. Communism is, quote-unquote, defeated. Some people in a hurry proclaim the end of history. The end of history meaning, okay, now there's no alternative. Market democracy is the realization, Hegel would say, of the spirit, with a big capital S. There's nothing big beyond that. We live in some kind of epiphanic moment. So the transition here happens at that moment, when indeed capitalism, financial capitalism becomes the norm, and consumption is spirit. So it's a shift then from a society of control to a society of consumption. In a democracy that is composed to a large extent by propertyless citizens. Propertyless citizens in a country in which the question of property has historically been the foundation for becoming agents, subjects, citizens, whatever you want to call it. So the question is, how sustainable is a democracy of propertyless citizens? People who do not own much, except their body, most of whom cannot pay taxes, but depend for their daily sustenance on state salaries and grants. How sustainable is this model? These questions, I think, acquire increasing urgency at a time when new ways of measurement of time and value are largely determined here as elsewhere in today's world by various encounters with capital and the market. So the point I'm making is that two orders of time are colliding here, and in bloated time, I mentioned it, but also a time that is in the process of recrystallization. And this recrystallization is happening around something we should call the operations of consumption. Consumption coming with a new ethos, in the sense that our new comrades today, objects are our new comrades. Now, it is a general rule that consumption runs on debt. Let me give you a few examples. Consumer indebtedness in South Africa has grown from more than 350 billion rands in 2002 to 680 billion rands in 2006, with an interest rate on short-term loans of 36% per annum. And by 2008, the figure had grown to 1.1 trillion rands. I mean, it's not yet the levels of indebtedness we find in the USA or in some other Western countries, Greece, France, for instance. But this is quite substantial. It signals that the fact that more and more a debt economy, we live in an economy in which you make money out of debt. You buy a bundle of debts, you sell them, and you cream off the benefit. And you do that through a huge variety of devices, most of them more and more abstract. To the point where in the US, for instance, people like yourself who go to universities, by the time they graduate, they are already indebted, but before they even start working. So the indebted man or woman is therefore a new figure we have to think about in this age of consumption, and at this time in which capital is experiencing huge acceleration. Let me start bringing this to an end. Let me bring this to an end by making two further points. And most of them have to do with the question of arts and culture. These are questions which are absolutely important in a society in which, because of all sorts of reasons, those who govern us believe that culture is more or less the same thing as agriculture. So when you haven't done well in government and they want to marginalize you, they appoint you in the Department of Arts and Culture. I also want to talk about culture, arts and culture, because as you know, some of the biggest scandals, biggest contestations in public culture in South Africa of late have had something to do with what we should call forms, aesthetic forms. To have in mind the big controversy around the president being painted naked and with the painting exhibited at the Goodman Gallery in Johannesburg, and so forth and so on. So most of the controversies we have had some kind of relation with this question of art and culture. Why is it the case? It is the case because in the absence of utopia, capacity to project oneself towards some kind of future, in the absence of that, and in the midst of the consumption revolution, a badly noticed trend of public life during the last 2 decades has been the re-emergence of official culture. Official culture was something that was quite dominant under apartheid. It is re-emerging. Official culture is the name for the process by which a ruling elite seeks to tame and domesticate its population by establishing official distinctions between the accepted and the unacceptable, the permitted and the forbidden, what we can see and what we cannot see, what can be represented and what should not be represented. It is the process by which it coerces its subjects into internalizing and reproducing truths not of their own making. It gives the illusion of life to inanimate forms, anachronistic and somnambulant forces. And in post-colonial and post-liberation context, such a process usually aims at depoliticizing the arts and unplugging their subversive potential. It usually goes hand in hand with a return to custom, which is a way of requesting subordination to authority in the name of tradition. And as a matter of fact, strident calls to traditionalism usually happen when a society is facing a generational crisis. Generational crisis is, by definition, a crisis of reproduction. In post-colonial and post-liberation context, the reassertion of official culture always goes hand in hand with a carnivalization of politics. Politics become a big laughing game for laughter. People laugh, roles are inverted. Those of you who can should read Bakhtin, Russian author on this. Michael Bakhtin wrote a really interesting book on the work of a French author called François Rabelais. It has to do precisely with the role of laughter in contexts in which structures of meaning have been put upside down. And people have been so disempowered that the only way in which they can get to the authority is to laugh at the expense of the authority and mimic it, insult it, spit at the authority, but through process called carnivalization. And this, when this happens, we know from other contexts that the ruling party is in a state of intellectual decay. Intellectual decay and proliferations of forms of lumpen radicalism that privilege a politics of expediency in lieu of a disciplined politics of principle and method. The carnivalization of politics usually rides on a surplus of toxic energy within culture. This toxic energy is generally aroused as a consequence of the increasing polarization of the social structure. And in the South African context, I think a deep-seated, a repressed, or a denied racial anger and the quasi-impossibility this country has experienced of turning shame and guilt into debt. And what has happened here from a political cultural point of view is that the shame of being compromised with a terrible past, the guilt, avowed or not, that resulted from it, none of this has been turned into a moral debt. It hasn't been converted into a moral debt. The TRC hasn't been able to do that. The ANC, in the post-TRC moment, has not at all been interested in doing something about it. Thus today, for instance, the collapse of the ideal of non-racialism, which is co-opted in fact by conservative forces who equate non-racialism with colorblindness, and the receding of the demand for justice that comes out of the history of this place and needs to be attended to. So short of all of that, we see emerging new forces that are aiming at forcing the issue. They are trying to force the issue in two ways. By, on the one hand, by playing it safe through parliamentary politics, and two, by adding to the parliamentary process an insurrectionary channel. So playing both things at the same time. So it seems to me that if we are to get out of this, we need to learn how to turn South Africa once again into a laboratory for democratic experiment in the 21st century. Short of that, signs of cultural entropy will be everywhere to be seen, and the kind of indecision in culture we see right now will increase. Thank you very much.
Thank you very much, Achille. Now we're going to open up. We have about half an hour at most for questions. So I will take about 2 or 3 or 4 at once. Is that right? That we can Achille can deal with them. So, 1. Yeah.
Achille, the question about the temporal framework that you started to talk.
Can everybody hear? Or should we circulate? I don't think we can circulate the line.
Okay, I'll show.
Yeah.
It's really it's a comment that I'd like you to respond to regarding the temporal framework that permeates your Marvel's talk. And it strikes me that there is, on a social and socio-cultural level, there is a concealed psychoanalytic reading of the temporal structures that pertain in contemporary South Africa, where there seems to be a compulsion to repeat the past in a way that disavows that vision of the future. And that compulsion to repeat is a compulsion to repeat unpleasure. And it's to repeat the unpleasure of the power relations in the interests of imagining a future that is entirely presentist and privileges the ANC elite. And it strikes me that what you were saying about certain forms of art and culture, specifically science fiction and the carnivalesque, are perhaps the only symptoms that point to the imagination of a different future. So rather than representing an implosion, they actually represent an alternative route. But they're also dealing with the compulsion to repeat unpleasure in the kind of dominant science fiction tropes in contemporary South African science fiction. It's often zombie stories, the literal return from the dead, to take over shopping malls. That's a governing trope of contemporary South African zombie fiction. District 9, of course, speaks for itself. And the case of the spear, Brett Murray's painting in the Griffin Gallery, is a specific reference to the socialist discourse promising the alternative future of the Leninist constructivist poster, onto which the President Zuma's head and genitals were daubed. So it seems to me that those represent, rather than an implosion, a kind of positive insurrectionism that may be a counter to the gloomy prospect you were painting. You could comment on that.
Can I take anyone else? Please try and keep your questions as short as possible so that we can allow everyone, as many people as possible to make a comment. That is, if you want to make a comment. It doesn't seem to be anyone else tonight. Oh, yes.
Michael?
Yes. Okay. Hold on. One, then who else? Yeah.
Yeah.
Okay.
My question is about a certain skepticism you expressed at the beginning of your talk about whether South Africa has become or is on its way to becoming a failed state, which people like Alex Borrell have referred to. And I expected that you would then go on to talk about some of the positive movements that are happening on the ground, for example, in the field of education, the whole work done by Equal Education Section 27 and others, as well as in the area of housing, work done by Abatlali, etc. I thought that maybe those were the kinds of things that you would talk about. But all that you said seems to reinforce the idea that we are indeed on the brink of a failed state. So I'd like to know how you define the term, and in what sense we are not on that brink. Thank you.
I've got a question on the idea of toxic energy. Is toxic energy not potentially a useful manifestation that perhaps help keep the leaders or the so-called patrons under check? Because should they not fear that people who do something that is unpredictable, then they can just reign over them anywhere? I have got an example of a country just over the Limpopo where there was very little manifestation of toxic energy in the years after independence. And that resulted in the entrenchment of dictatorship as we see in Robert Mugabe today. So I would perhaps, I don't know whether I would be able to persuade you to rethink about that notion of toxic energy and see it as potentially a positive thing in the African state.
These are three very interesting questions. I take them on. I mean, what they are suggesting is that there's a way of reading some of the tropes I offer in a different manner. Science fiction, for instance, those pieces of in literature, but also in cinema and in music. Those spaces which exhibit somewhat what I call dystopian imagination, but a dystopian imagination that could be harnessed in of itself as a resource for something positive. I think indeed that particular resources offered, especially by crime fiction, have allowed, in some instances, for the emergence of some idea of redemption. There is a redemptive dimension of science fiction, which we see not only in what is produced in South Africa, but also in the traditional Afrofuturism, which is so typical of Black America, and more places like Nigeria or Kenya. So I would like to take that suggestion seriously. Where I'm somewhat apprehensive is in the fact that of us being left caught, or many being left caught between traumatic pasts that we are unable to transcend, and a future which appears to have little use to us. If this were the case, then it seems to me that we will be in trouble. But let's hope that something can come out of science fiction. Same applies to the area of toxic energy. On toxic energy, I'm somewhat yes. If by toxic energy we do not mean the worse the better. Worse the better meaning, okay, let's use the negative dimensions of a situation and multiply them in the hope that if the thing collapses, something might emerge out of it that is positive. But understand that that's not the sense you give this idea. Failed state. Look, I mean, I really don't think that we can seriously consider South Africa to be a failed state. I just don't believe that. If you want to, a failed state is like Somalia, for instance. You have no government. You have warlords fighting against each other on almost anything. You have the majority of the population that has left the country. They try their luck elsewhere, except where they were born and where they would really want to be. they would want to live in their own country, they cannot. They go elsewhere, they come like here in Somalis, is to have a session with Nuruddin Fari, a great Somali writer. And in the room, somebody asked him, Nuruddin, you have a voice. We have left Somalia. We cannot live there. We don't have a government. We don't have a recognized sovereign institution protecting us. There have been 2,134 Somalis killed in South African townships over the last 5 years. Why don't you speak since you have a voice and you are listened to? A failed state, that is what it is. South Africa is like, the poodle leopard. How do you see that? Yes, yeah, those animals, they have. Yes. You have pockets of total inertia, inefficiency. You also have pockets of excellence. When you take the bureaucracy, the Internal Revenue Service, I think that's how it's called. No, it's not called. That's the US equivalent. Yes, SARS. It's working perfectly well. It is typical of a Weberian bureaucracy. It's not like Greece, that Michael is telling me. And he must know what he's talking about. But you also have, what is striking in South Africa, you have a facade of modernity. Excellent buildings. And then you get in and things do not really operate according to typical modern rationale. So what I mean is that it's a very complex tapestry. And what is really interesting in South Africa is that, for the time being at least, those efficient institutions equalize, if you want, that which is not entirely working. And it's very difficult to analyze that kind of, experience. And the other thing is that we should know by now, it's very difficult to foresee what will happen here. Why? Because it's a society that is going in many directions simultaneously. And in our vocabulary, in our language, social sciences, we do not know how to deal with things that go in multiple directions at the same time. We know how to talk about things that go from A to B and B to A, but not A to C and C to M and M to L, no. So this oscillation, the fact that it's a place where, I mean, it's like waves in the ocean. Waves keep coming, but they are never exactly the same. It seems to me that that imagery of waves is more capable of capturing the deep dynamics of a society that is profoundly modern. And at the same time, a society that is profoundly conservative and extremely empirical. A society that also has developed, unfortunately, an extraordinary capacity to not take itself and its realizations seriously. I don't know whether this is English or Zulu or whatever, but it's striking that, for instance, South Africa, in the histories of democracy in the modern world, is the only country that has a possibility of reconciling race and democracy. And it's not taking it seriously. It is the only country on earth which has that possibility. The United States has not been able to do that. Racism is re-emerging in the whole of Europe. in a place like France, which is my second country, we do not know how to talk about race. Of late, the president, François Hollande, came up with the suggestion that, in fact, we should abolish the term in the Constitution. The idea being that maybe, if you abolish the term, then you solve the problem. So it seems to me that in order for South Africa to be in the world we live in, the career of something unique that is valid not only for South Africa, but for the humanity in its entirety, we have somewhat to take seriously our experience here, historical experience here. Take it seriously, meaning invest in thinking critically about it. And this question of critical thought, the importance of the humanities at a time when they are dismissed and they are under siege, without that capacity to nurture critical thought, our democracy will be at a peril. And we won't be able to give to the world what we are disposed uniquely to give. So, discourses on the failed state seems to me are sociologically wrong and, let's say, from a political point of view, do not, let's say, I prefer the discourse on potentialities, if you want.
Next round of questions. Hands up, please. 1, 2, yeah, 3.
I don't have a question, I've got a comment. I liked your descriptions of South Africa and the complexity of the South African state, the way in which some things work and some things don't work and so on. But some things don't gel with me. So, for example, you've described us as operating on a transition from control to consumption. That's one big statement you've made. And yet, in the description of the nature of the state, you've spoken about wagelessness, propertyless citizens, and great indebtedness. So for me, it begs the question of what is the relationship between these kind of structures of how many people are wageless, who are the wageless, what is the relationship between the wagelessness, the propertylessness, the indebtedness, and on the other hand, the possibility for consumption. Who's doing the consumption? So it's and literary analysis kind of is able, we can pull that out, but for me, it seems you also need a bit of a structural analysis to be able to account for this nature of the set, because as you said, it is being made, and it is being made in this form, and it is being reproduced in this form. And as you said, it is part of what it pre-existed in the apartheid state. And some of there's a disjunction for me between your recognition of these things, and in a sense, you're also not taking them seriously. That we also need to theorize and
question of ethnicity and how, African subjects who mostly identify with a lot of ethnic groups, and ethnicity, I think you problematize it in a way that I agree with in terms of post-colonial South Africa and how it's become a problem and how we can't entirely move forward with this sort of way of thinking or how it's been appropriated by colonialism and now something that people have to take up. So I'm interested in how people can take up ethnicity or rethink ethnicity moving forward in ways that it doesn't necessarily take away from their livelihoods as it's been post-colonialism. That's if that is possible. But maybe, the alternative of moving forward without ethnicity, I'm not sure how imaginable or possible that is, but I'd like to get some of your thoughts on that.
Earlier, we spoke about how I say capital accumulation is based on cheap labor, such as agricultural and mining sectors. Of particular concern to me is this emergence of a new sort of cheap labor, volunteer labor, wageless sort of labor in communities, where suddenly the South African government is embracing this new global rhetoric on volunteer work, where you have, which is initially a foreign middle-class concept, which is associated with principles of philanthropy and all that. And suddenly it's being introduced under the guise of the African philosophy of Ubuntu, that now communities must care for each other, but suddenly it's been institutionalized and being called volunteerism. So my question is, what do you think is the relevance of the application of this concept of volunteerism in the African context? And also, what do you think of the manipulation of African philosophy to suit particular interests? Why are we using poor rural communities who are themselves in need to carry out certain basic services to the individual community?
Okay, first question. Look, I said it at the beginning. I wasn't. At some point, we have to accept that either we have asked the wrong questions, or that there are just too many things we don't know about. Things we don't know about, not because we are stupid, but because whatever we say is always somewhat, always comes somewhat late in relation to the velocity with which societies are transforming themselves. And that is, the fact is that our discourse on our societies is always behind the capacity of those societies to generate new forms, and our vocabulary is even unable to account for. So I want to take that epistemological position positive. I want to embrace it. It is a position of humility, that we will never know everything, and little we know is but a small portion of what needs to be known. Second, we have to learn how to ask proper questions which do not keep us repeating what we have already said, but which allow us to explore whatever it is that we're dealing with in a different manner. The project tonight was to, if you want, build a puzzle. I was not at all interested in any systematic exposition. I was interested in coming here and building a puzzle that people who come and listen go out and think, okay, for instance, why is it that the ANC is so contested and yet it wins the elections? What are those paradoxes? Why is it that so many different things are happening and colliding, colluding, all of that, and never producing the kind of consequences that one who is rational would expect them to produce? That's all what I wanted to do. And then I took examples here and there But for me, that is the enigma, not only of South Africa. That's where the research imagination should take us. So now you ask me to put all these parts of the puzzle together. And I say I'm not going to do that. I'm just not going to do that. I mean, I can come here and give you figures of number of people who are on social grants. I can give you contested figures on number of unemployed people. I can use the work of Jeremy Seeking and tell you about the ways in which those who have formal jobs redistribute what little they earn with those within their domestic units who are not working. But, I mean, these are things more or less, or if we don't know about them, we sense, have the intuition that they're happening. I was interested in a different kind of, let's say, questionnement. And I believe that thinking provisionally is absolutely important. So I was involved in provisional thinking as a method, as provisional thinking, conjunctural thinking, taking risks with thought. Which doesn't mean that you will hit the target all the time. You might miss a lot of it, but it allows us to be alive, to keep our minds alive on things we take for granted, and we have stopped questioning them. And the big danger, I've lived in many other places. I'm not saying that the other places are better, but a big danger here is to stop questioning, is to stop asking questions and take things for granted. I'm not saying that that's what you're doing. I'm just thinking with you, extending what you said, because I think it was absolutely important, your intervention. So if we want to move forward, we cannot stop thinking. We cannot take anything for granted. So that's one thing. As far as ethnicity is concerned, you see, I understand your question, but I will answer differently. The part of what is going on is that there was a transition in 1994. A transition that left in place a lot of the structures and institutions and logics that existed prior to transition. But a transition that also came with all kinds of new resources and power for anyone who is taking seriously the project of transforming this society. It's not true, for instance, that the Constitution is an obstacle to land reform. It's not. That is simply not true. What is true is that the question of property, which is the foundational différent in the history of South Africa, question of property and dispossession under multiple forms, that question has not been yet properly addressed. It just hasn't. It hasn't for all kinds of reasons. It hasn't because we do not have a historical precedent of how it is that one reverses centuries of dispossession. We do not have a book to read, okay, they did it here, let's do it here. There are many other reasons in inefficiency. We're talking about the bureaucratic state in South Africa. It is far less efficient today than it used to be. Although I was reading before coming here over the last few days a very interesting work on race and bureaucracy. It's a study of the Department of Native Affairs. from 1948 until the time when it was abolished. And what is a study done by an historian, what he shows is what we're talking about. That you have a tapestry, you have a state that is capable of grand design. Apartheid was like that. It's capable of having pockets here of hyper efficiency, but most of the time it is really inefficient. It cannot control everything it wants to do. So some of the reasons have to do with that. When one studies what's going on in the Department of Land Affairs, a huge part of it is lack of political will. A huge part of it also has to do with pure inefficiency. The rotation of bureaucrats. They come today, a year later they are gone somewhere else. No continuity. You can have a design, but you cannot implement it. And when we talk about a developmental state, one has to laugh. So, you have all of that. Basically, the government has not been able to resolve the question of property in class terms. And what it is doing, consciously or not, right now, is trying to do it by resurrecting the native question. When you look at what Verwoerd did with chiefs, and you compare it with what is being done today, or the kinds of proposals, legislative proposals, that are being debated, you have to wonder what's going on. The irony is that if you look at these documents, you will tend to say that, oh, so President Zuma, in fact, is now recognizing that Verwoerd was right all along. That is the irony. Go and read it. It's all public. Just Google the recent laws on traditional chiefs and all of that. It's a neo-Verwoerdian policy in relation to these crucial matters. They are seriously important for all kinds of reasons. First of all, if they were ever to be adopted, they will consecrate the division between, on the one hand, citizens in urban areas and subjects in rural areas. They will have serious consequences in terms of women's rights, and even more importantly, they will have dramatic consequences. They will open up a new cycle of dispossession in the benefits of the new black elite. And the poor blacks will pay once again. They will pay for one single reason. We are discovering now that the former homelands, where people were dumped, subject to erosion of that, today they represent the new mining frontier. That's where the new minerals, the minerals of tomorrow, that's where they are deposited. And when you give power to the chiefs to transact land and refuse private property to black people who live in the homelands, you are recreating the conditions for a new cycle of dispossession, which is not racialized because they all belong to the same quote-unquote race, but which is a class kind of, but using nativism, custom, tradition, as a justification for a policy that is purely unequal. And even worse, I don't know how often you read newspapers. You must have heard about King Zwelithini, who got married the other day. Huge pomp, great marriage. For those of you who are interested in getting married. So he got married, and he has initiated of late a huge land restitution claim, or he's in the process of And a number of other chiefs are thinking exactly in those terms because the Land Restitution Act has been now reopened for I think the next 4 or 5 years. If this thing is not dealt with properly, it will lead to the reassertion of ethnic identities. We will see new ethnicities emerging, new clans, new lineages, and South Africa being embroiled in all kinds of ethnic conflicts which will have to do with access to resources and their redistribution in a context that has nothing to do with apartheid, but which uses the frameworks, intellectual, mental frameworks of apartheid long after the latter has been formally abolished. So it's those paradoxes, those contradictions, it seems to me that are calling for new intelligence, if you want, and new forms of activism and citizenship intervention. Because they are not simply technical matters, they are fundamentally political questions, and they have to be addressed as such. In that context, what it is that voluntarism might mean. It shouldn't have to do with the extraction of labor from poor people without pay, because that has been going on for too long. It has to do with the invention of new kinds of work. At a time when the calculus has changed. Yesterday, we fought because we thought we were exploited. Today, people fight because they are no longer exploited. That is worse today. What is worse today is to not even be exploited. So, if that is the case, it seems to me that one has to try to invent new realities of work, taking into account the kinds of challenges we face. The other day I was traveling in the Eastern Cape from Bantu stands in Transkei with a group of 60 people, running around the country. You travel there, from Swaziland to Durban to Kunu to Ginsberg, and we took that road that goes indeed through the former homelands. Overpopulated, overgrazed, no water, all the signs of former segregation still on the landscape. And you wonder, okay, what would it take to bring life back to these places? And of course, it is possible to bring back life into those places that look like dead places. It's possible to undertake massive projects of planting trees to begin with. It is possible to initiate massive programs of bringing back water into those places, of creating ecologically sound jobs, so that people don't need to go to Cape Town where they are taken as refugees in their own country. It is possible to do all of that. But it's not possible to do all of that by transacting the land and the minerals underneath the land to traditional chiefs in the name of custom. So it's that kind of new imagination that has to be opened up for people of your generation. Because those who are doing it now, they won't be there when the time comes to face the consequences. And a depoliticization of students, of young people, is the worst that can happen to this country. So let me just end there as a way of bringing together a certain kind of intellectual intelligence to bear upon questions, civic and political questions, that all of which can open up a space for new imagination. Thank you very much.